alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be with you all. Welcome to this special segment of Political Struggle for Justice titled Withdrawal from Afghanistan, Turning Point for the American Strategy. I'm your host, Batool Subeiti, super duper excited to be joined by Richard Medhurst and also by Mohammad Marandi. I will just start off by introducing them before I go on to the next segment. So Richard is an independent journalist. He's also a producer and he's the host for Press TV, and he's also a contributor to RT. Mohammad Marandi is a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran and a political analyst. So before I dive into the questions, I want to briefly begin by giving a context around this very important topic. We are not looking at Afghanistan per se as this isolated case, but seeing the withdrawal of America in the context of the wider regional developments. So, of course, America's trajectory is going down in the region. It is one of withdrawal from the West Asian region as a whole, reasons which we will dissect in more detail. We will also seek to understand the forces that will ultimately fill this gap created by the withdrawal, given, of course, we now live in a multipolar world, and the withdrawal will add a new formulation in the presence of active regional and international forces. We will seek to gain a better understanding of the Taliban movement that seized power in Afghanistan in August this year, the development of the Taliban over the past 2 decades, and its relationship with entities like Iran that is, of course, known for its open and diplomatic policy. So just a very brief intro into the Taliban for those who don't know much about them. So they arose out of a civil war in the 1990s in Afghanistan. And this was after the Soviets were expelled. So they seized control of the central government in Kabul in 1996, and they ruled most of Afghanistan until the US invaded in 2001 in what was their notorious so-called war on terror strategy. So in retrospect, the launching of the American strategy in West Asia, it began in Afghanistan. And those extreme Salafist movements that arose under the American auspices, for example, Al-Qaeda, they were launched specifically from Afghanistan, and their functional role at first was to fight the Soviet Union. But later then, they became a part of the existing factions within Afghanistan. The Taliban, however, they had not originally fought the Soviet Union and then later turned against the Americans like Al-Qaeda did. Hence, America was not strategically sensitive towards an entity like the Taliban. The important point to make over here is that the Taliban themselves were founded due to the West's need to enter Afghanistan and to unite it under this single banner that America can have a presence in, since investing in Afghanistan required the US to have some level of stability there. And in addition to that, you had the role of Pakistan in the emergence of the Taliban. This was during Senior Bush's administration. And this was also within the American strategy for the whole area. This was in a similar manner to the role of Turkey in sponsoring terrorist organizations within the so-called Arab Spring. Of course, this was during Obama's administration. So, of course, the Taliban themselves cannot exclude themselves from being labeled as the product of America and Pakistan. That is their reality. So that was just a bit of background about them. I want to go straight towards you, Richard, now. Richard, it's so lovely to have you here. I hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on here, Batu. Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you so much. The pleasure is all ours. Okay, so America has been, of course, occupying Afghanistan since 2001. Although for some time, of course, there has been, questioning around the role of the US in Afghanistan. What exactly are we doing there? Exactly 2 decades later, we're witnessing the US's withdrawal. And I want us to take a bit of time to kind of dissect this and to break it up into several parts. Can we talk about, firstly, why is America withdrawing at this point in time? The nature of the withdrawal that was so abrupt, what this says about the strategic importance of West Asia to the US, given their withdrawing, the shift in the balance of forces on the ground, and America's position in the world more generally.
Right. So I think that there are several reasons explaining this. I know we can look at it, of course, as an embarrassment to the United States. It certainly is on multiple fronts. They spend trillions of dollars allegedly fighting the Taliban, only for them to, resume power. It's like nothing changed, right? The reasons they're doing this, one of the main reasons is China. So they want to refocus their efforts on China, and of course, China is a neighbor of Afghanistan. They share a border. And they're doing this in numerous ways. Just the other week on CNN, you can see Jake Tapper with James Clapper, the former chief liar for the NSA who covered up their mass surveillance. And they were talking about how they need to shift their focus. The Americans need to shift their focus from the Middle East and fighting terrorism towards China. And it's so funny the way they talk about it. They talk about it as if it was just a distraction. You're like, oh, that thing in the Middle East? No, never mind. Let's use a new threat. So there's a visible shift towards China. And AUKUS is one of those things, this new military alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. So that's attacking China or antagonizing China, from the Indo-Pacific, from the other side, from the east. But when it comes to the shared border with Afghanistan, the United States and Britain, they've been supporting separatist movements in China for many decades now. When they talk about China, usually it's to accuse China of committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority in China, predominantly in Xinjiang province, which is very near to Afghanistan, where they share a border. And the thing is very interesting because just last year in 2020, Donald Trump removed the a very major Uyghur terrorist organization from the United States list of terrorist organizations, which is kind of an indirect, kind of a tacit endorsement of the group, right? You're no longer a terrorist. You're not a problem for us. Go ahead, do your thing. And this is, of course, one reason why they've left Afghanistan, but also not entirely, because in their absence, what do we have now? You can see there are mosques being bombed. They're trying to turn it into a mini Iraq. And so the CIA is also there. The head of the CIA admits that the CIA is staying. And it's very important to note that. I always bring this up because when Afghanistan was invaded, it wasn't like Iraq with a massive aerial bombardment, shock and awe. It was gradual buildup. So the first people on the ground were CIA paramilitaries. And if the CIA hasn't left, I mean, how can you call it a withdrawal? It is, of course, a withdrawal of conventional armed forces. But it's important to note that special forces and intelligence, they're remaining there. So they are playing a role. Although they're shifting their focus, the Biden administration is really indicating that their main focus is going to be China. We must appreciate and understand that there is going to be a continued presence or influence of the United States in Afghanistan. And well, I think we're going to get to this in perhaps in the next questions to dissect it more in detail. But there are multiple reasons for that, right? And I think really the main reason they're doing this is to shift their focus on China, because China poses an enormous economic threat. And I don't like using that word because for capitalists, for imperialists, a threat is just someone who's doing better than them. If you look at the map, it's the United States that has tons of military bases around China, not the other way around. You don't have Chinese bases in Mexico or the Florida Keys or warships off the American coast. So when we talk about threats, we really have to understand who's threatening who. So that these are some of the main reasons. And I think the United States, what have they been doing for 20 years in Afghanistan? Not just making money for the military-industrial complex. They've been threatening Iran and China. When you have U.S. military presence on the left, right? So on the west, if we're talking about Iran, on their western border with Iraq, and then on their eastern border with Afghanistan, this is a threat. This is a large military footprint meant to intimidate, meant to antagonize Iran, and the same for China, right? So now they've removed these bases, allegedly, and they're replacing it with a terrorist threat. They're trying to turn Afghanistan into what Iraq became, unfortunately, for a few years, where you have this sectarian violence, which, if it isn't there, they at least create it or they amplify it. And so they create things that were not really problems before. Of course, they exist to a certain degree, but America comes in and makes them 10 times worse, 100 times worse on purpose. And this is what the West has done always in the Middle East and West Asia. They always come in, they literally carve up our lands, our borders, our countries with new borders. They divide us on sectarian lines, and they try to pit us against each other. And this is what they're trying to do now in Afghanistan to, sow chaos again on Iran's border, on China's border, and of course prevent Afghanistan from rebuilding under a Taliban government, because it's humiliating for them to have a Taliban government there.
Absolutely. You've raised some very crucial points, in particular to that of China and the need to kind of migrate from West Asia, rather shifting now towards East Asia, from towards the China Sea, and Taiwan is probably more of a strategic location for them to attack their biggest rivalry now, which is China. But of course, another very important point over here is just the simple fact that America could not sustain a stable presence in the area if you take into account the victories of the liberation axis. And this accumulation has been something that's very gradual. Changing strategies with politics doesn't come as this decision not regarding what's actually happening on the ground. Iran's strength on the ground and its proposal that America needs to withdraw, I'm sure that that's further reinforced that America couldn't protect their presence there. And so those changes in policies come to a turning point in which they dictate they have to leave. The whole new Middle East project has completely gone in tatters. They've failed to use ISIS as the functional role that it was for the US to topple Syria, to, of course, cause that havoc in Iraq. That's definitely something to play. In terms of withdrawing abruptly, it's also clear that Biden was in full knowledge that the ensuing vacuum created by the withdrawal would be filled by the Taliban. And it's clear also that America is betting, as you've mentioned, on the regional conflicts occurring that can weaken the anti-American imperial axis, hitting enemies with enemies, essentially allowing the Taliban to play that functional role, which they'd only given to ISIS before. And this functional role, of course, it results from the Taliban's mentality of confronting all entities that disagree with them and exploiting those contradictions that exist between them and the neighboring countries. But one of the implications and the hidden risks of this approach include the basic lessons that the Taliban may have understood throughout the events in the past 25 years. Professor Marandi, are you on? Okay, so I think he's having a few technical issues, so we will come to him as soon as he's on the show. So I'll go straight back to you, Richard.
Sure.
When we say the Taliban of 2001 is not the same as the Taliban of 2021, can you give us an idea of how the Taliban may have developed throughout these past 2 decades, and what are some of the lessons that they may have learnt along the way?
Well, again, this, whether the Taliban have changed is I think it remains to be seen. They've only, resumed power for 2 months. And for example, just in the West, they've been always talking about women's rights, trying to justify the occupation with women's rights. Well, okay. Has there been any progress on that front if we take this argument? I don't know. I don't think so. We're still seeing mixed reports. The Taliban say they're letting women go back to school. Others are saying it's not true. I think they're struggling to even set up a state, right? So I think the most important lesson for them, if we compare to a few decades ago, is they want to be seen as more legitimate now. I think that there's a need for them to be accepted by their neighbors, most of all. So we're talking about Iran, China, and of course Russia nearby, because they need to build a state. They want to be seen as a trusted neighbor, one that is under a neighbor that has things under control. They want access to trade and commerce with their neighbors and the world at large. So they have a need to be seen as a legitimate government, because if we look back in 1996 to 2001, as you mentioned, during their first so-called administration or caliphate, they were recognized by 3 countries. I think it was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. So, I mean, they had no legitimacy back then. And right now, no one recognizes them either, actually. So they really have a need to be seen as such. And given that, they might change their behavior, or they might change their policies. They might change their outlook on certain things. The EU, for example, the West are saying, if you don't comply with these requirements. One of them, for example, being human rights and so on, which is, I mean, again, that when the West talk about human rights, obviously they don't actually mean that, but they're saying, you know, if you want access to humanitarian aid, you want access to all this money that we've been pumping into Afghanistan for many years, you have to do such and such. So, you know, it remains to be seen whether they've actually changed. I think the biggest thing, as I mentioned, was their need to feel accepted, to be seen as a legitimate government. And that will, of course, require cooperating with their neighbors most of all. So, you know, Iran, for example, they want to see a government that is multi-ethnic, that is pluralistic, and they want no civil war, of course. You know, a big need for Afghanistan's neighbors is not to have a civil war in Afghanistan, is to have a secure neighbor, because it's good for them as well. They don't want more chaos on their doorstep. They've just had 20 years of American war on their doorstep. So, you know, these bombings that we've just seen in the past few weeks are extremely horrific and tragic. And at the same time, they indicate that the Taliban does not have things under control. Of course, given what America does, given, you know, the role that they play, it is hard to you know, take control of the country when you have external forces that are trying to wreak havoc, of course. But you know, it doesn't inspire that much confidence. And I think the policy that from the neighbors for the moment has been, let's see if they change, and then we will see if we recognize them, if we establish full ties and normalized relations with them. And yeah, so I think this is something that is just a question of time, whether, you know, they really work on being accepted by their neighbors, and it just remains to be seen. I think it's too hard to tell at the moment.
Absolutely. You've made some very relevant points there. And it's, of course, it's also true that the main experience of the Taliban during the early governance, if we're talking about 2 decades ago, prior to 2001, it was within warfare. But now they're in a position, they're in a governing position, and they understand that, you know, a functioning economy is necessary for people's livelihoods. It's necessary for people's survival. So the Taliban right now is more aware of the reality of the situation. They're more aware, as you've mentioned, for their need for the neighboring countries, and is therefore likely to actually be seeking to reduce tensions with the neighbors rather than to ratchet it up. And this is an important point to make, because, of course, this is exactly what America was betting on, and this is exactly what America was hoping for. But there's also another interesting point, and that is that it is precisely because of those extreme Salafi movements that existed, like Al-Qaeda, that Taliban ultimately had to pay the price when the US invaded in 2001. As it seemed, they, of course, created that as the pretext, but that was because they were using Afghanistan as a base, then Al-Qaeda and the rest of them. So that black and white outlook of the Taliban during the earlier governance, that kind of stone-minded outlook that they had, at least, you know, one could say the leadership right now is more pragmatic for sure, with Iran, with the Shias more broadly. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, you can see they've had not full normalization with their neighboring countries, but they have had meetings. And of course, this is not just, I think with it's important to note that this didn't just start in the last 2 months. It's also been going back a few years now that, you know, Iran, for example, has been trying to mediate and make sure that, you know, some progress is achieved, because, you know, Iran certainly doesn't want an American a military footprint on its, you know, it has enough of that, you know, all sides of the border in the Persian Gulf. And so, you know, that's been important as well. But yes, they definitely, the Taliban leadership, I think, I do sense that they're a bit more pragmatic in terms of international relations and trying to work things out with their neighbors. Whether that translates into what they do internally in terms of, as we say, you know, in the West, they make it just about women's rights and whether they comply with what the West wants. But I'm just talking in general, whether that actually translates into a better country for Afghans. I think it's too hard to tell yet. But, you know, as you mentioned, they really do have to think about where this is going to go, because you need money to run a country, you need trade, you need neighbors that are willing to work with you. And if they don't recognize you as a government, I mean, you're really stonewalled. And then all you have is some, I know China, for example, has just been sending a bit of aid. I think they just sent $30 million recently. But yeah, this is not enough to sustain a country. So they definitely need to take control of the security situation, and then, of course, trying to establish ties with their neighbors. This is really number one for any person running a country.
Absolutely. It's the idea that it's in the net interest of the Taliban to maintain those good relations for their own sake, if they want to be in governance and in a position of rulership. And it's also interesting if you compare in 1998, for example, when you had the massacre in Mazar-e-Sharif and they killed 11 journalists, and I think it was 11 diplomats and 1 journalist. And you compare that, for example, to the fact that in 2021, when they took over and they seized control, Iran did not remove its presence from Afghanistan. It didn't stop its plans. It didn't remove its television satellites, not from Kandahar or any other place, and in the middle of areas where the Taliban was active. So that's also something interesting that I witnessed as well, that could kind of indicate that there is some kind of development in idea and thought. It's the fact that it's also witnessed, for example, Iran successfully deal with its opponents and to turn the balance of forces in the whole region to its favor, such that America is now withdrawing because it's not in its interest to remain. So it's extended some bridges of confidence there as well as a result of the experiences. And so, yeah. Is Professor Marandi with us? Can I just confirm from the organizers? Okay. That's fine. So we'll go straight onto the third question with you, Richard. Your responses have been amazing so far. If we can just talk about the relationship now, more specifically between Iran and the Taliban. The reason that I want to explore this even further is because many will say that the Taliban, for example, has a history of persecuting minority communities. And they will constantly say, for example, look at how the Hazaras are being treated. And the Hazaras, it's not just the case of, ISIS-K that has been responsible for massacres. The Taliban has as well. So the question here is, why has Iran been fostering this kind of open policy and diplomacy with this entity, not recently, but since the collapse of the Taliban's government in 2001? So throughout these past 2 decades, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, just right off the bat, I would assume that, the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, would apply here. In a sense, even though the Taliban and Iran are not exactly best friends, they are resisting a common enemy, a common invader. So I think that has been one part of it. I think just from a sensible point of view, it's completely rational for Iran to try and foster relations with, their neighbor, because, at the end of the day, it's in Iran's best interests to again not have terrorism, not have a security situation, not have an unstable partner or neighbor rather, and you don't have to be best friends in order to establish ties, but you do have, there must be some bridges built. And I think it's important to note as well that in Iran you have millions of Afghans who actually live in Iran. You have, as you just mentioned, you have Hazara Shia minority that is in Afghanistan. So, they don't just share a border, they also have common populations between themselves. And so recently what we're seeing, these terrible attacks, you had one in Kabul against a Sunni mosque, and then 2 bombings of Shia mosques, one in Kunduz and one in Kandahar. This is, I mean, what I think is happening here is, as we said, the United States has left, and they've purposely, left a power vacuum. They know that the Taliban doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the strength to deal with these threats. And so now you have this sectarian violence flaring up, but it wasn't there before. I mean, you had it to a certain degree, of course, but we're not saying that every country is perfect, every society is perfect, but they're trying to amplify things and make them 10 times worse, like they did in Iraq. So these atrocities that are happening now in the past month, it's very important to pay attention who benefits from that. I don't think I don't think the West want to see Iran and Afghanistan establish ties because, their whole strategy has always been divide and conquer. This is the name of the game. So, whether the Taliban has good intentions, even if they have good intentions or not, you have to consider, what are the external actors doing to the country? What are they? What influence do they have over the situation that is contributing to violence, that is, maintaining a state of chaos? Because, it's very important to note this. You look at Iraq and you look at Syria. They try to do the same thing there. They try to fund all these terrorist groups. They always try to amplify sectarian violence. Always, even in Lebanon right now, they're trying to do the same thing. Just a few days ago. So the situation is no different in Afghanistan. And even if Iran has the best intentions towards Afghanistan, and I'm sure they do, and even if the Taliban have the best intentions, we have to consider what are external actors doing to the country and trying to destabilize any peace process or normalization of ties or rebuilding of the country. Because, as we said, this is extremely humiliating for the Americans. They certainly don't want any prosperity for Afghanistan if the Taliban is in charge, because it just how would that look if, they try 20 years of nation building, and then the Taliban is able to integrate into the Belt and Road Initiative, able to, have trade with all of its neighbors, establish a good security situation. It would blow a giant hole in this whole myth of America being a nation builder, which I think a lot of people have woken up to is a lie, but this would, further amplify that. So again, we have to look at what external actors are doing. And I think, again, it's really just sensible for Iran, sensible for China to want to have ties or peace, at least, with their neighbor, even if they're not exactly on the best terms, or even if they don't see eye to eye. So that's really, I think, just a basic necessity for all these countries to have to find a path with the Taliban, even if they don't see eye to eye.
Absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of looking at this issue holistically and understanding that what determines the main policies for a nation like Iran, or even a nation like China, for example, it is the general interests and not, partial issues pertaining to certain communities, but it's rather considering that it is within the general interests that the partial interest takes its proper place. So Iran isn't going to build its policies towards an entity like the Taliban on the basis of protecting the minority Hazaras. Rather, it's the best protection for such a group is when you deal with those wider issues. So, for example, whilst you have significant sums of money that's being funneled through Saudi Arabia, other regional countries to support Takfiri factions within the Taliban, the policy of Qasem Soleimani, the former leader of the Quds Force, was to create that kind of mutual understanding. It was to kind of tame the Taliban and get the more moderate factions out, and for them to be the representatives and the leaders, essentially. And this strategy is built upon an understanding that, hold on, the Taliban, you can't erase this group of people, right? Like, they have some significance amongst the Pashtuns. And one day they will fill this kind of void when America does leave. They had that kind of foresight to understand that America will leave because it is unsustainable. So we cannot look at things from a very narrow perspective. That's a very important point. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, just a small comment, because you raised this very obvious truth, which is that the Taliban, they are an integral part of Afghan society, Afghan politics, whether we like it or not. So Iran understands this, China understands this. You have to deal with them. You can't just erase them, as you said, and just get rid of them, which is that's more of the American mentality, right? Like, they came into Iraq, they did de-Baathification, and I mean, I don't need to tell you what happened afterwards, right? So there's a completely different mindset and mentality to dealing with these situations, and Iran understand that. And while they're not glorifying the Taliban, they're not celebrating them as friends, they're being cautious about it and waiting to see what happens. And they want to make sure that, it's a pluralistic society, a pluralistic government thus must be created logically. And of course, the moderate factions, they will play a key part in that, because, it's just in everyone's best interest to have equal representation and not, again, kind of a replay of what we see America do in other countries.
Absolutely. And what you've just said has made me think about this other point, that it's precisely this kind of open policy, let's say, that Iran has kind of tried to foster, that has really allowed it to be effective in those mediations during the recent months, that has ensured, to some degree, at least until now, that a full-blown civil war hasn't erupted in the country, at least until now. And that's exactly something that the US was betting on. So had it not actually tried to at least foster this kind of relationship, for the sake of taming them, for the sake of actually seeking to protect the likes of the Hazaras, I mean, I think that was one of the key conditions that Qasem Soleimani himself stipulated towards the Taliban was, ensure you don't attack the minority communities. You have to maintain stability on the border with Iran. How can it get to a point of actually having that interchanged dialogue had it not fostered that open policy and saw beyond the whole, there's a contradiction between us and the Taliban, so we're going to oppose them and potentially enter a confrontation in which America benefits. It always goes back to that point of, how is America benefiting from this? How are the imperialists themselves benefiting from this? And understanding that's the key, that we don't want to fall into that trap. Absolutely. On to the next question, because I'm assuming, again, Professor Marandi. Has Professor Marandi joined? No. Okay. That's fine. Okay, we'll go on to our next question. This one is kind of seeking to make a kind of future projection. So it's analysing a little bit into the future. What do you reckon, Richard, are the changes that will be enacted in the region after the American withdrawal? And what are the effective forces that you feel like are going to fill this gap now that America's gone?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one is the Taliban, right? They took back the territory. I mean, almost the entire country in the span of, what is it, a week or two or something. I think the only thing that was left afterwards was a few provinces. But, you know, they took back the country very quickly. They really exposed the Afghan security forces as being nothing but a myth. You know, the whole time you had all these generals that would come on CNN just for 20 years, not just, you know, Democrats or something, but all Republicans, Democrats, all of these administrations lied about nation building in Afghanistan. They didn't nation build anything. They robbed the country. They made money for themselves. And, you know, the Afghan security forces that were meant to take over, I mean, they just didn't exist. This was a lie to justify the war, to keep it going. And so the Taliban took back the country very quickly with almost no resistance. I think one of the reasons they did this, as Professor Abrams suggests, Professor Max Abrams, he suggests that, you know, they were able to do this because they had a policy of not killing civilians. And of course, the discrepancy here is between the leadership and the common or lowly fighters. I can't remember what the term is that he used, but, you know, of course, you would have civilians being killed because, you know, the branches themselves were kind of isolated from one another. There wasn't like a complete command structure like in a regular conventional army. And so it was hard to kind of implement this policy, but just, you know, out of principle, they were against this. And so his point is that that's why the Afghan people did not see them as such a huge threat that the United States made them out to be, and that there was not so much resistance. So that's the first thing. I think it's the Taliban, very obviously. The other actors, obviously, what we're seeing now with ISIS-K, I mean, I really love how they just come up with new flavors. They invent, you know, new terrorist groups in Langley, and they just throw them out there. You know, first, it's like in Iraq. First, we had Al-Qaeda, and then all of a sudden you have the ISIS popping out of nowhere. Now they have ISIS-K. You know, every day they come up with some new group, which conveniently is implementing the exact same agenda that would benefit in dividing and conquering the region. And so, you know, you have fighters that are coming in from the Middle East, battle-hardened ISIS fighters that are trickling into Afghanistan. We know, for example, that you have the Uyghurs. You have a few thousand of them who are in Idlib in northern Syria. But you also have some of them in Afghanistan who, you know, the latest attack, if we look at the mosque in Kunduz,
the one
ISIS-K.
last week.
Exactly, right, where over 100 people were killed or wounded, so mostly Hazara Shia. ISIS-K claimed the attack, and they made a point to say that the suicide bomber was a Uyghur, right? So you can see that they are playing a role also on the border with China and Afghanistan. They're playing a role as well with you know, having extremists funded you know, by the West. By Turkey coming in there and destabilizing the country. So this was expected, as you said, because America was betting on having a civil war. We knew that there would be a power vacuum when they leave. The Afghanistan, you know, the Taliban cannot be expected to rule over Afghanistan with complete authority because they just don't have the resources and the manpower for that. And so it was guaranteed that you would have groups like this taking advantage of the situation to cause chaos and you know, to provoke sectarian violence, to amplify that, to hopefully provoke a civil war for, you know, which is what they want. And so I think we're seeing, unfortunately, the same plan that we saw in Iraq. You're having terrorist groups that are indirectly or tacitly endorsed by the West, coming in, destabilizing the country, taking advantage of the power vacuum, because even though the Taliban took over most things, they still don't have complete control or money or authority or resources. So this is what's happening, unfortunately. These are some of the actors that are filling the power vacuum, right? That are filling the gap now that America's left. And I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that America was a stabilizing force, not at all, because, you know, some people really believe that. They think that America's presence was making sure that you didn't have these kinds of bombings and suicide killings, which is a complete absurdity. If you just look at what was happening in Afghanistan, it was chaos all the time. And even the Americans could not control all of Afghanistan. Helmand province was never fully under anyone's control. Under the British or the Americans, they can never take full control of Afghanistan. No one has. And that's why they call it the graveyard of empires. But yeah, I just wanted to be clear. It's not like America was a stabilizing force. It's just that they know that after pulling out their conventional armed forces, they can do things like this. They can have groups like ISIS-K all of a sudden creating havoc, blowing up the airport, blowing up Shia mosques, and trying to provoke internal strife and a civil war. This is what they want.
Exactly, and that's all a part of the American strategy anyways, because ISIS-K itself is a product of America and are simply their proxies, as you mentioned, doing their functional role. But Richard, would you agree that the American trajectory on a whole in the region is going down? I mean, despite the loss of life, which is extremely devastating, and these attacks that we see one after the other, and the kind of upheaval that it is causing for the actual people who live in West Asia, the American trajectory itself is going down, and the liberation axis is only gaining strength.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think on the whole, if we look at, for example, in Syria, if we look at Iraq, if we look at Lebanon, the resistance axis, when we're talking about the Syrian army, we're talking about the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, we're talking, or the popular mobilization forces, as they're called in English, or we talk about Hezbollah in Lebanon, we talk about Iran coming in, and defeating Al-Qaeda, defeating ISIS in Syria, helping the Palestinian resistance, the Lebanese resistance, the Iraqi resistance. All these groups have certainly caused a downwards trajectory. They ultimately, despite the loss of life, the tragic loss of life, as you mentioned, despite all these millions, it's really in the millions of people who've been martyred, who've been killed by these crimes against humanity from the West. They did not succeed ultimately because their goal was to create a completely new regime in Syria to overthrow the government and put in a puppet government that is not a threat to Israel, that it will conform to their interests. They didn't succeed in this. They failed. Hezbollah defeated Israel. They liberated South Lebanon. They defeated Israel so badly in 2006, they haven't dared to come back. So, you have a stronghold of the resistance front now that is keeping them in check, most certainly. I think in Afghanistan, the thing is, although they're trying to implement their agenda there, it remains to be seen whether they succeed or not. I don't think that they will ultimately. I think they will also end up failing, just like they did with their withdrawal, just like they did in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon. And the thing is, I would caution, however, that if we look at Saudi Arabia, we look at these Arab kingdoms or Arab states in the Persian Gulf, I don't think that has necessarily changed because, they're always going to be America always, is always with its allies until it doesn't need them anymore, as we saw. But I think for the foreseeable future, they will definitely stay in bed with them because they're milking these Arab states or Arab kingdoms for money. Trump overtly just admitted this, that they pay for protection. Essentially, they're it's a client state, Saudi Arabia, and so. Yeah, exactly. And they need the oil. And so for the time being, I don't think that has changed. But certainly, most certainly, the resistance front is making gains all over West Asia. And you can see that the war on terror, which is a giant scam, is nothing but a money-making scheme for the military-industrial complex. And it's an imperialist project, but it's ultimately going to fail.
Absolutely. And it seems there is also that change in strategy, going from that whole military presence. Okay, ISIS has failed. The functional kind of state actors that we've created have failed. So we're just going to go towards sanctions. We're going to go towards the soft war. Exactly. That's a huge part of it, is the misinformation war, which is, I think it's unprecedented. It's never been to this extent. And I think Lebanon is a very good case study of that. And the extent that it has reached. Would you say that the region is losing its strategic importance to the US? I mean, you spoke about oil, you spoke about energy. It's clear that America right now is really ascending in the ranks when it comes to domestic oil production. And obviously, energy security was one of the core reasons that it decided that it wanted to invade West Asia. So what would you say about that? When you have all these opposing forces, when you have China, right, that is has huge economic growth plans, when you have Russia that has these huge military growth plans as well, and these military retaliatory policies. And when you have Iran, obviously, that's just not budging when it comes to things like Israel, that's just not budging when it comes to foreign influence. And you have, as you've mentioned, they've already milked the hell out of Saudi Arabia. I don't know how much more they can milk, how much more there is to milk. What would you say about the importance of that region for the US? Is that declining?
No, I don't think entirely. Of course, as we said, Biden is shifting focus to China, but the Middle East, since the dawn of time, is the most important place in the world, in every aspect. It's the cradle of civilization, so it's always going to be important for whoever is running the biggest empire or superpower on earth. And it's not just about resources, because as you mentioned, the United States is ascending in the ranks in terms of oil production. They don't have they're not exactly they don't have a complete shortage of oil. It's not just about that, although that is a part of it. I think another main pillar of this is preventing countries in the Middle East from accessing their own resources. When we look at Syria, Syria is not really a huge oil producer in the world. They don't even rank in the top 10. But for Syria, oil it counts for 25% of the government revenue if we look at 2010, so just before the war started. So that's enormous. That's a quarter of the government's revenue. You need this for social safety nets, for public funding, for subsidizing food. So now with the sanctions, which you mentioned, for years, ISIS has been stealing the oil. They've been selling it to Turkey. Various actors have taken control of it. But right now, with the Caesar Act since 2020, when Trump put that in place, and Biden is, of course, continuing it, the whole goal is to deny Syria access to its own resources. Iran, for example, you can look at how after the nuclear deal, which, it wasn't exactly, the best deal, but after the sanctions were lifted, and they didn't lift all of them, actually, but they did lift some of them, and you can see how oil exports went up in Iran, and this helped the economy for a bit. And what did Trump do? He comes in and he specifically targets the banking sector, the oil sector, because they want to kneecap Iran's economy. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, and it can't even refine them because it has no infrastructure. It's been decimated by U.S. sanctions. So it's not just about the U.S. needing oil from other countries. It's about preventing countries that it doesn't like from accessing their own oil. And that way it can cripple their economies, their oil-based economies. And it's not just about oil. Of course, they have other exports and resources. And I think, frankly speaking, if we look at Iran, if we look at how they've done under sanctions, they've done remarkably well. Even Cuba, they've found ways to circumvent sanctions. And it's quite exemplary, honestly, because sanctions are siege warfare. It kills people.
Absolutely.
And so for them to find other ways to mitigate this, to keep their economies going, of course, it's not optimal, but still it indicates a lot of strength. Syria, for example, was self-sufficient, was a net exporter of wheat. And the same regions in Syria, so Hasakeh, Deir ez-Zor, which are in the east and the northeast, they not only contain the oil, the largest oil reserves in Syria, but they also contain, this is the breadbasket region, as it's called. So all the crops are grown here, the major crops. And Syria also doesn't have access to these. So, the sanctions are, again, about preventing Syrians from accessing their own resources, whether it's crops, whether it's cotton, whether it's oil. It doesn't matter. It's about bullying other countries by stealing their resources, holding them hostage, bullying them into, coercing them into accepting whatever policies you're trying to implement on them, regime change, forcing them into the international monetary system, and so on. I think that's really a main function of it.
Absolutely. Precisely as you say, you've hit the nail on the head as always. But this also has the effect of also backfiring. The more the circle of exclusion by America from the global financial circle is enlarged, you have the parallel market, those on the other side, of course, because many countries, as you've mentioned, are being put under American siege. Those will gain strength. Those would form their own alliances. We're seeing, and Iran has experience in dealing with the parallel and underground market for so long, as does Afghanistan as well. So in the new world system being constructed, the American hand is weakening, and this has its effects and results. And America themselves, even, it's interesting, they've started giving exemptions. So, for example, for some states in Iraq, the closest and cheapest trading routes that they have is Iran. So they tell America, we have no choice but to deal with Iran. And America thinks, okay, whether we give Iraq the okay or not, they're going to trade with Iran. So it's because they have no other choice. So America then just gives the allowance because it says we'd rather give them the allowance than them do it without us giving the allowance. And it seems they're going above our word. And then, they also don't want the circle outside of American domination to grow. So they're stuck in this kind of position where they want to impose those sanctions, but at the same time, they also, don't want it to backfire. Professor Marandi has joined us. Salam alaikum, Professor.
Alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me.
It's so lovely to have you. We are quite short on time, of course, because we are 47 minutes right into the show. But thank you so much, Richard. But please stay on.
I will stay on. It's great to see you, Professor.
Thank you, Richard. Well, I don't think you really needed me. Richard's much better at speaking, and he's very knowledgeable about what's going on in the region. And his Twitter account is very good and informative, and so are his shows and programs. So I'm sure your viewers haven't missed anything.
You're both amazing, and you're both doing amazing work. Okay, if I can come to you with the final question that we have. America is withdrawing from the region of West Asia, as it seems, and Afghanistan is obviously that case study scenario that we've been talking about today. Professor Marandi, how do you feel like this will affect the interior relations of the countries in West Asia, given many countries are obviously relying on America and are under its support? So, for example, the Gulf state.
Well, that's a very complicated question. And I think what is obvious to everyone is that the United States is on the retreat. It's moving. It's not withdrawing from the region completely, but it is withdrawing. And I think it's because of the sheer burden of the military expenses that it has imposed upon itself over the past 2 decades. And that is going to make it more difficult for the United States to control the situation in future. I'll leave Afghanistan out for a couple of minutes. To allude to a question you raised earlier about, for example, the price of oil. If there's instability in Iraq, for example, the price of oil will go up. And that is not good news for the United States, because you are correct that the United States is self-sufficient. But the companies that produce oil in the United States, a lot of them do it by fracking. There's not any real benefit in fracking. It's a heavily subsidized industry. And second of all, if the price of oil goes up, what is important is that the consumer is hit hard. The consumer in the United States is no different from the consumer in Iran or the UK or China or India or South Africa or Argentina. So when the United States withdraws, what happens is that new forces come to play or move and expand their influence in the different regions. And US allies also lose their confidence. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others, and most importantly, the Israelis, most importantly, because they are the closest to the United States by far, they lose their confidence or their self-confidence because they're not quite sure how far the United States will go to maintain their regional influence, to maintain their internal stability, or to protect their regional expansionism or actions in the region, such as in Yemen, or in the case of for the Israeli regime in Lebanon and Gaza, the West Bank, and elsewhere. So the withdrawal of the United States has major implications. And in Afghanistan, I think we saw the greatest symbol of the U.S. retreat. Not only did the United States suddenly withdraw, and the president the U.S. president, he made a very firm decision to withdraw, even though everyone was against it. I think it's because he understood that the United States is hemorrhaging, it's bleeding too much, and it cannot stand up to China, at least in the way that it wants, under such circumstances. But also, I think the way in which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan is symbolic of the incompetence of the United States and how it has degenerated, how it has declined, and that it can no longer even manage its own affairs in a way in which it used to, even though the U.S. military is funded, very generously by the United States at a time when the American people are facing grave difficulty and the middle class has been on the decline for decades. With regards to Afghanistan, I think it's quite clear that the withdrawal of the United States on its own is good news. Everyone in this region is happy to see the Americans go, because the United States and its allies have simply been a menace. They've been manipulating Afghanistan for their own purposes. They never developed the country, contrary to the nonsense that we see on in Western media outlets, and also the country has always been in shambles. If it was doing so well, why wouldn't the people defend the country in the face of the Taliban? And ironically, the Americans helped to bring about the defeat of the occupation by sanctioning Iran, because Iran is Afghanistan's most important trading partner. It's by far the most wealthy country that has a major border with Afghanistan. Yet the Americans, through the sanctions, they prevented, and through pressure on the government, they prevented cooperation between Iran and Afghanistan. And the same is true with Iraq. In Iraq, the Americans, even though, as you rightly pointed out, they would give the United States would give Iraqis permission to do limited trade, but by doing so, they discouraged economic cooperation with Iran. They prevented a great deal of economic cooperation with Iran, and that held Iraq back and continues to hold Iraq back, because most Iraqis live alongside the Iranian border, from Basra to up alongside the Kuwaiti border, all the way to the border with Turkey. Overwhelmingly, Iraqis live within 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers of the Iranian border. So the Americans like to shut down the natural trade routes and business, and to break up the natural business relationships that exist between the two countries. They've been holding the people of Iraq back, thus creating further dissatisfaction and anger among Iraqis who already dislike the US occupation. So in Afghanistan, the fact that the Americans have left have created great opportunities for Afghanistan. But of course, there are two major issues. One is the Taliban. We know that the Taliban has a very dark past. No one can hide that, and no one wants to hide it. But the Taliban has, in some respects, evolved. There are factions within the Taliban that do not want to see a repetition of what we saw 2 decades ago. There are factions in the Taliban that are just as extreme and dangerous and ruthless as they were 2 decades ago, but there's a major conflict within the Taliban itself. And so we have to see which side gains the upper hand. And of course, the more moderate faction, the more reasonable faction of the Taliban, which is not weak, they want to have a government where the Tajiks, the Pashtuns, the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, and others can work together and live together as a nation. And that is what Iran wants, and that's what I think most Asian countries do want. So who would not want this to happen? Who would want the Taliban, the war within the Taliban, the fight within the Taliban to move the country towards, who would want the more extreme factions to gain the upper hand? Who would want, forget the Taliban, who would want Afghanistan to be unstable? The countries surrounding Afghanistan are Iran, Central Asian countries, Russia by extension, China, and even India. So India is not a real ally of the United States. The United States is using India today, trying to push them towards confrontation with other countries. But when the time comes, the United States will try to keep India weak and incapable of becoming a major power, because the United States, its official policy is for it to be the only superpower on this planet. So the only side that has a vested interest, the only major player that has a vested interest in a weak Afghanistan, is NATO. It is the United States, and by extension, I would argue that would include all of NATO and every single country in NATO, including Turkey, because Turkey works within the framework of NATO. So, and that's one reason why the Turkish government was so insistent on having control of the airport in Kabul, because they wanted to be able to move the extremists around that they have supported and aided in Syria, in the Caucasus, in North Africa, and elsewhere. The remnants of ISIS, which Mr. Erdogan created, of course, with Western support, with Saudi support, and with the support of Arab oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf. Mr. Erdogan, the Al-Qaeda forces that exist in Syria and their affiliates and similar and like-minded organizations, they, just as they were used in Syria to strengthen NATO and to weaken adversaries of the United States, and in Libya and in Yemen, as we speak, Al-Qaeda and ISIS fight alongside the Saudis very openly, and it's not something that has gone unnoticed in the Western media, but it's not been condemned in Western countries or by the media. But just as they've been used as strategic assets by the United States in those in that part of the world, they have been sent out. Their movement to Afghanistan has been facilitated by the very same countries that supported them in Syria and in the other areas that I spoke about. Why? Because if the Americans and if NATO can't have Afghanistan, then no one should be able to benefit from a stable Afghanistan. So Iran is trying very hard to prevent the Tajiks and the Hazaras and the Uzbeks and the Pashtuns who are opposed to the Taliban, especially since the Pashtuns are divided into two groups which are mutually, they've had a lot of hostility and they continue to be hostile towards each other. Iran is constantly telling its friends and allies to have patience and is trying to help the Taliban, to the more moderate faction, to gain the upper hand. But the Americans, and their allies, with supporting extremists, are doing the same thing that they did in Syria. So we are at a crossroads. Either the situation in Afghanistan is managed in a way in which the country doesn't move towards civil war, or it plunges into civil war. And why do you think, for example, or your audience should think about, why is it that Afghan assets have all been frozen and the sanctions put in place? And the country is going, especially Afghanistan, which has a very harsh winter in general, this will be devastating. So why would anyone want to devastate Afghanistan? Why won't the Americans and the Europeans allow people to be fed? Because they're using the sanctions as a tool, just as they use sanctions as a tool in Syria. The Americans are openly trying to starve Syrians. This is not an exaggeration. The NATO countries, all of them, want to starve the Syrian people to bring them to their knees so that they can get their way. It's the same story in Venezuela. It's the same story in Cuba. It is the same story in Yemen. And it is the same story in Afghanistan. And of course, Iran as well. Or what we saw in Iraq, when the Americans literally murdered, the numbers are different, but when a reporter put this to the US Secretary of State, I think you all know this quote, but when they told her, was it worth 500,000 children dying in Iraq because of the US sanctions? Madeleine Albright, Clinton, the husband, his Secretary of State, said that, yes, we think it's worth it. So sanctions are like war. They're to kill, they're to murder, they're to destroy. They want children to die. They want women to die. They want people to lose their lives so that they can get their way. This is exactly how it works. That's not the intention. That is the exact intention. They're not targeting leaders. They're not targeting the military. They're targeting intentionally ordinary people. They pretend it's otherwise, but that's the exact objective. So the same is true in Afghanistan. So the more Afghanistan becomes impoverished, the more unstable it becomes. So Iranian intelligence and the intelligence of other countries in the Russian intelligence, everyone knows exactly where the ISIS forces have gone to. And in fact, Iran helped the Taliban over the past few years to fight ISIS. We all know how ISIS got into Afghanistan. So the same people who are now trying to strangle the people of Afghanistan, they facilitated the growth of ISIS. So again, all I can say here and now is that those who want an unstable Afghanistan are those who want to prevent Asian integration, who want to prevent growth and prosperity in this part of the world. And those who want Afghanistan to be stable are those countries are those countries in this region that have been harmed by US policy. So I think probably the greatest sacrifice has been made by Iran, because Iran has been hurt by the Taliban. Iranians have been murdered by the Taliban. Allies of Iran have been hurt and murdered by the Taliban in the past. But Iran recognizes that for the sake of the Afghan people and for the sake of regional stability, they have to work with them. And this is one of the ironies, because on the one, enemies of Iran have always played, they've always played the sectarian card. They say, for example, they say in Syria, Iran is sectarian. But then they say right now they're opponents of Iran, Persian-speaking opponents like BBC Persian, Deutsche Welle Persian, VOA Persian, and Iran International, which is a Saudi channel. They're constantly attacking the Iranian government for supporting the Taliban. So the Iranians are being bombarded day and night by these arguments being put forward by Western-owned and controlled media outlets that your enemy is the Taliban and your government is not fighting the Taliban. So they're pushing Iran to bring instability to Afghanistan, to be confrontational with the Taliban. But the Iranian government, because I would argue that since it is not sectarian, as we saw in its support for the Palestinians, as we saw, for example, the Kurdish Sunnis that were supported by Iran when ISIS attacked them, whether it's in Syria or whether it's in Afghanistan, Iran's objective was to defeat NATO. Its objective was to defeat those forces of chaos. And those forces in chaos in Afghanistan, they need to be dealt with by supporting the Taliban, but pushing the Taliban to be inclusive. In Syria, it is necessary to support the Syrian government. In Iraq, it was necessary to support the Iraqi government. So I don't know if I have a question. I'm very late in the evening and I've had a very difficult day, but so I'm not quite sure if I've been very coherent. I'm not a good speaker, Richard, but I apologize if I haven't been very clear.
You're too humble, Professor. You've been very clear, crystal clear, and I couldn't agree more with everything you said. They try to make it sectarian, and this is the oldest trick in the book. You know, they've been dividing the Middle East, Africa on sectarian lines since, you know, before we were born. And this is how they did with Sykes-Picot in the Middle East. This is their strategy now in Syria, in Lebanon. You know, we just saw these killings, this massacre in Tayouna the other day. It's all on purpose to flare up sectarian violence. And again, I think it's very good what you bring up, and important, because they always say Iran is sectarian, but this is ridiculous when you when we look at the truth. The examples you just mentioned, another one we could look at is Iran's support for Hamas. This is nothing to do with sectarian. This is to do with anti-imperialism. It's to do with defeating foreign invaders, occupiers. So it's that simple. It's that simple. And if you look at Iran, you look at Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, these countries all have different political systems and religions. What do they have in common?
Right.
Why are they allied with each other? Because they're fighting a common enemy. They're fighting white, Western European colonizers. That simple.
Yes, exactly. And I'm not sure if our host is still with us or
Oh yeah,
and
no,
whether
I'm
we have.
listening.
Oh, okay.
Please
Okay.
continue.
I thought maybe I should become the host now. Yes, I think it's quite obvious. I mean, Iran has been supporting Venezuela more than even the Russians or the Chinese. Venezuela is not a Shia country or even a Muslim country, or when Western countries were supporting apartheid South Africa, Iran was supporting the ANC, other groups, and Nelson Mandela. One of the first countries that Nelson Mandela traveled to was Iran, or Cuba, or Nicaragua. And it's not just, this part of the world. As Western powers decline, they use the same tool elsewhere. In Ukraine, the Western countries have been using Nazis just because they want to weaken the Russians. And as Western countries decline, I would argue that they're going to be more and more dirty in the way in which they use sectarianism, racial hatred. You see racial hatred towards the Chinese as we speak. If the Chinese are so evil and bad, why weren't they evil 5 years ago? Why, if you go and look at CNN, Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS, their archives, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was none of this material that we see about human rights and about the threat from China. None of that existed. How did it just suddenly emerge? It's simply because these countries have shifted their policy towards China. In the past, it was focused on Iran. Then it increasingly became Iran and Russia. And now it has become increasingly China. And while I would argue that the importance of this region has not declined, because the energy, and we're not going to see a green planet, if we do see a planet, if this planet continues to exist in the way it does now, we're not going to see a planet without the need for oil and gas in the near future. This area, this part of the world is key. Without a doubt, its importance hasn't declined. As I said, even if the Americans are independent energy-wise, if there's its rivals are not, and its allies are not, but even if there's a shortage of gasoline and the United States is energy independent, when people go to fill up their tanks with petrol or gasoline, if the price goes to if it doubles or triples, Americans are going to be just as hurt as people anywhere else. So this area is key for a host of reasons that we don't have time to get into. But the United States, the problem in the West is that liberalism and capitalism have eaten away the strength of Western countries. Two, their perpetual wars and the military-industrial complex that has pushed for these wars, which Richard has alluded to, these have further deteriorated the situation in Western countries. And three, the rise of rival countries, whether it's Iran, Russia, or China, or other countries. They continue to rise. So the United States, first it was Iran, then it was Russia, now it's China, and now it's just simply too much for them to be able to keep all these rivals in check, because the Americans don't know how to cooperate. They only know how to dominate. If they were sane, they would try to cooperate with Iran. If they were sane, they would try to cooperate with the Russians. If they were sane, they would try to cooperate with the Chinese. But they've antagonized all these countries, and it's just simply too much for them. So they're on the decline. Yet they've increased the number of countries that they despise and dislike. And as I said, the tactics that they use are dirty. They use racism, they use sectarianism, and they use it now against China increasingly. It started with Iran. It also continued with the Russians. And I think as things deteriorate further, they will be even more provocative. But I would argue that the West is on the decline, and that no matter what tactics they use, we're going to see further signs of that deterioration. Does that mean that it's going to be a smooth ride ahead? No, the Americans will try very hard to destabilize Iran. They will try very hard to create regional tensions between Iran and its neighbors. We see that in Afghanistan, we see that in Azerbaijan and Armenia and in Iraq and Syria and in Lebanon and in Yemen and elsewhere. We'll see the same thing in Central Asia, we'll see in Central America or Latin America. We'll see it across the board. It will be, the road ahead will be tough, but as long as Western countries fail to recognize that they are no longer in command, I think that their fortunes will continue to decline, and ultimately they will have to fully withdraw from what I prefer to call West Asia.
Absolutely. Nail on the head. As usual, you've hit the nail on the head. Thank you both so much. Just before we finish, I just want to hear the closing remarks from you both. So if I can start off with you, Richard. Any closing remarks? Anything you might like to say?
I think the professor really put it very eloquently, that it's not going to be a smooth ride. It's not going to be easy. That's the whole point of resistance. It's resisting an oppressor. But I do think that the future is hopeful. I do think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's going to come a day where, just like the French were kicked out. You can go through a whole list of empires that have been kicked out of the Middle East. The thing about Syria, the thing about Iran is that you always find ruins. You find these beautiful, World Heritage sites. And these are ruins of empires that are long gone. And just like, these empires, the Americans will also end up leaving. The British will end up leaving. And I do think that there is hope. And of course, I'm really glad that the professor brought up or busted this myth of Iran is sectarian and they only support Shia. This is such nonsense, and it's because of Iran's progress in defeating ISIS, defeating Al Qaeda, defeating these Western proxies, that they demonize Iran. And it's just all part of the sectarian propaganda campaign. And the professor is correct. The West are no longer in command. If you go, like we said, if you go back and look at the press archives, there's nothing about China. The difference is that China's economy has gotten larger. They feel, quote unquote, threatened because they don't like competition. They want to dominate and monopolize. That's what it's really about. It's always about money. It's always about empire. And I'm really grateful for the program, for you guys having me on. And it's really wonderful to have to be graced by Professor Marandi's presence. And I'm humbled for you having me on the program. To talk about this, because it's so important to put this into context, to look at what's happening. And just one last thing I would say, in the last week, look at what they did in Lebanon. Look at what they did, the bombings in Afghanistan, the Shia mosques there. Look at how the Israelis bombed Syria twice. Look at what they did in the elections in Iraq. There's a full assault on the resistance, and at the same time with AUKUS against China. So, people have to be vigilant. We have to report things how they're actually happening, and drift away, get away from this Western lens of things. And I'll just say one last thing. I agree with the professor. We should start saying West Asia more instead of the Middle East. I prefer that much more. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's such a pleasure being in such like-minded company.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you so much, Professor Marandi. You're both so inspirational, particularly to so many youth here in London. I know they constantly follow your content online. And again, the work you're doing is amazing in countering all the misinformation and all the propaganda that is continually being perpetuated by these tech giants. Professor Marandi, any last thoughts, closing remarks?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very grateful to be with both you and Richard, and to have an opportunity to speak to your audience. I think it's quite clear that Western countries, their intention is to dominate this region and to maintain what used to be their full control. And we have to be wary about sectarianism, whether it's directed towards Sunnis or Shias or Druze or Christian or the secular, anyone that is native to this region right now and beyond the region. I think that the Americans and NATO would like to see a divide between those who support the resistance in Latin America and those in West Asia and North Africa. The colonial domination and neo-colonialism has to come to an end. Not only must we decolonize this region, but we must also decolonize our minds. And in order to decolonize West Asia, we have to be recognized that before anything else happens, before we do anything else, our priority is to expel NATO. Our priority, for the sake of everyone in this region, is to expel these domineering regimes. And I, as some of you know, I call them regimes because they like to call our countries or governments regimes. So I'm returning their kindness back to them, in my own small way. So in order for us to be able to grow and thrive, they have to go. And I have no doubt that once they are gone, you will see that sectarianism will decline automatically. You will see that across West Asia, the situation will improve. Right now, why do you think that Shia mosques are being targeted in Afghanistan? Why do you see these mass murders in Afghanistan? Because they want to hurt the Taliban. They want to create tensions between the Shia and the Taliban, and the Tajiks and the Taliban. And inside the Taliban, they want to, because they want a fight. Those forces that bring about these atrocities, they want to fight. They want to see Afghanistan plunge into violence. Why? Because, as I said, then it hurts Iran, then it hurts Central Asia, it hurts China, it hurts Russia, it hurts the whole region, because it becomes a catastrophe that we have to deal with. And the stupidity of the Europeans, the stupidity of the European governments, is that they are the ones in NATO who pay the most. When they destroy Syria, where did the refugees go? They go to Europe. When they destroy Libya, where did the refugees go? They go to Europe. When they destroy Yemen, when they destroy Afghanistan, when they destroy Iraq, where did the refugees go? When they impoverish Lebanon, they all go to Europe. They don't go to the United States. The United States prevents these people from entering their country. So the Europeans, or even Mr. Erdogan, they are paying the price for the policies, the destructive policies that they've been pursuing. Turkey right now deprives Syria and Iraq from water. They're using water from the rivers as a tool to punish ordinary people. Most of these people are Sunni in Syria, where the rivers pass through, but they can do that because they're working within the framework of NATO. Israel, just the other day, assassinated a Syrian citizen, a Druze citizen, from inside Syria. They shot him from across the border and murdered him inside Syria. No one in the Western media complained about it. Why? Because the intention, the objective is to destroy this region, to weaken the region. But again, as I said, when they strangle Syria, when they deprive them of water, when they support extremist groups, where do the Syrians go to? They're going to go to Europe. They go to Turkey. Then you see tensions rise between Turks and Syrians, unfortunately. Then you see right-wing fascist groups in Europe on the rise, complaining about refugees. Well, if the European governments were truly sane, then they would pursue policies where people would be able to remain in their own countries. If our countries were stable, if Western countries refrained from manipulating our countries, we wouldn't need to go anywhere else. The people of this region have no reason to go to Europe and the United States. They would be fine where they are. So again, finally, the only 2 points I'd like to repeat here is that A, we have to be wary of any form of sectarianism. The Western Persian language media uses racism and sectarianism as a tool. The Arabic Western media and Western regimes supported by Western countries use the Arabic media in the exact same way, but targeting Iranians. In Iran, they target Arabs and Sunnis, the Western Persian language media, and in Arab countries, they do the exact opposite. So it's divide and rule. We have to be wary about their sectarianism. We have to be very careful about not falling into the trap of civil war in Afghanistan. And finally, we have to try to help ordinary people in the West who do not have a free media, who do not have an open media. We cannot have these conversations on Western in any mainstream media outlet. We have to create greater awareness in European countries in particular that your interests are not in pursuing American policy in West Asia. Your interests are not served by following the United States in West Asia and North Africa.
Absolutely. Thank you so much both for alluding to such important points. Again, having that insight, having that foresight, looking at the long term, not being so emotional or emotionally charged when it comes to politics is very important. Understanding oppression is also not sustainable. There is certainly hope. There is certainly light at the end of that tunnel. Thank you both so much once again. Your time is really appreciated. May God bless you both. May God protect you both. And if everyone can please just keep their prayers and remember in your du'as those who are oppressed.
Have a very good evening.
You too. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz.